Welcome to another edition of Politics and Right. My name is Egberto Willis, your host. Thank you so kindly for being with us today. John Pavlovitz is a writer, pastor, activist, and storyteller from Wake Forest, North Carolina. Over the past decade, his thought-provoking blog, Stuff That Needs to Be Said, has reached a diverse worldwide audience with over 100 million views. A 25-year veteran in the trenches of local church ministry, Pavlovitz is committed to equality, diversity, and justice, both inside and outside faith communities. His books include A Bigger Table, Stuff That Needs to Be Said. And guys, you got to check that one out. And If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. He currently directs Empathetic People Network, which I just learned about, believe it or not, a vibrant online community that connects people from all over the world who want to create a more compassionate planet. Brother John Pavlovitz, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, so good to be with you again, my friend. Hope you're well.
I am doing well. Well, I want to start it this way because these are your words. It's not enough to be sickened by the injustices and atrocities around us. We have to be a visible and vocal presence in the world. John Pavlovitz says, we suffer from a poverty of empathy. We must fight for the people that we love, for the nation we dream of, for the causes that matter, for the world our children will inherit, for our relationships and our own health. Such is the stuff in his new book, Worth Fighting For, Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending, is made up intentionally launching during this critical election year. Pavlovitz, the pastor who lost his church speaking up for the rights of the LGBTQ community, returns with his outspoken yet compassionate voice, his unique version of hope in a book when it's needed. And I tell you what, I don't call that outspoken. I call that just, damn it, telling the truth.
Thank you, man. And that's the way I've seen it since I began. People early on, when I, as a pastor, started speaking out, they would say, you're so courageous. And I just say, it's really not courage. It's simply telling people what you see from where you are. And we all have a responsibility to share life as we see it and as the truth unfolds in front of us. And there's really no option. It's not about courage. It's about simply doing the humane thing. And that's what I've tried to do.
Well, that's. I mean, I think that's what anybody who calls themselves an activist in this world, I think that's what they're compelled to do. Now, when you pretty much left your church, you had a certain amount of authority there. Did you feel liberated, able to really do what you know in your own, whatever your ideology is, to be humane? Did you feel that liberation to do that?
I did, primarily because doing the work of a minister, I didn't realize going into it that it was a very political position in a small p, that you have to manage the expectations of many people. And because of that, there is a bit of inauthenticity that can creep in when you're not truly able to speak your convictions clearly. And I nudged my community as far as I could and then went to another church community, and I didn't have that equity of trust and didn't have that relational capital, and things didn't go well. But once I was outside of that, exactly, I was able to ask anything and say everything and just be completely honest about where I stood. And that's when the word started to reach people. That's when the audience grew. And for me, it's been a reminder, just that's the only thing we can each do, is to speak our most authentic truth and live with what happens as a result.
I like to speak about spheres of influence. When I speak to my audience, both on air, on the radio, and on my internet programs, what I try to promote is that every individual, I am not a rugged individual. I believe in community. I believe in our social well-being, but I believe all of us intrinsically have a sphere of influence, and those spheres of influence overlap. And who you are determine what your sphere is going to look like. And in following some of the work that you do, I've watched you establish your own sphere of influence. And what's interesting here is people gravitate to it organically and not because they believe they have to be following some orthodoxy or following something. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. It's been important for me from the very beginning because when I started speaking, I was not speaking on behalf of a political party or a religious institution, but simply as an individual who had these tensions and questions and prompts. And people who those words have resonated with have joined us in that. So the words became a hub for a really disparate group of people. But you're right. I believe that we all have this proximity to humanity in our circles of influence, and we have a responsibility to work within those places. So you don't need a massive platform or a podcast or a blog. You simply need to work in the small and close of your life. That's where you have proximity and agency, which is what the book and really what all of my work is about.
And I think it's been very effective. And like I said, it seems to be even more effective as you are able to do it, not like I said, not as an individual, but an individual who people gravitate because the message means something to them. Now, I find it interesting that, again, I got a little pre-release of your book that I kind of just scanned through some of the things. And I found it interesting that in the first part of its first chapter, you have a title that's a segment title, "The Mental Health Crisis of MAGA America." And by God, I am not trying to disparage MAGA at all, but it has taken over such a part of our entire political ecosystem and otherwise that I am actually happy that it placed that far up, that top of your book.
Mm. Well, doing the work that I do, I travel all around the country in person and online, and I call myself a collector of stories, a war
Hmm.
correspondent, people sharing what's happening in the trenches of their lives. And over, the theme is exhaustion and its relational fracture. The relational fracture and the exhaustion are really what's happening here. It's not about political ideologies or warring theologies. It's really about where all of this settles down into our lives and our relationships. And so, looking at that mental health crisis of the past 8 years or so is really just acknowledging all we've been through politically, plus the pandemic, and that people are simply not equipped to deal with this much trauma and this much grief. And we need to attend to it as much as anything else, as much as the issues and the legislation, there is that personal collateral damage.
Now, it is interesting because you brought up that the amount of trauma that we're feeling and it's coming from all directions.
Yep.
It seems like what people like you and others have done by taking the bull by the horns. There was a time where we always looked for the patriarch to solve the problem,
Mm.
but we found out that the former hierarchical models don't work anymore, and that it's more a collaborative, networking type of model that we all need, especially because of the vast size of the country, the vast different identities that we have. How, and I kind of think I know the answer to this, but how have you used that in both your book writings, your social networking, and etc., to bring it all together?
That's a great question. I think for me it was looking at the elemental things of life. Where are we all universally placed? And I look at things like fear and grief and loneliness, and those hit us all, regardless of our politics or our theology or our life stage. And so I try to speak to those things, and then to the universal parts of being human, about empathy and generosity and kindness. And that's what I think it has been, this, as you said, this organic assembly of people who may not have identified themselves as a tribe of affinity without the writing. And so I've just been grateful that it's been a spot for them to gather and then to decide, now what do we do collectively? We work individually, but what do we do as a group of people who are passionate about some of the same things?
Now, you had a flock. You were a pastor. But as one of I don't want to say pastoring is in decline, but organized religion is in decline. That doesn't mean that spirituality is, or all those things remain. The things that people want remain. How have you taken your experience as a pastor, both negative and positive, as a pastor, to form your sphere in such a manner that you don't hold on to the negatives that people just associate now with, let's say, the evangelical movement and many of the religious movement?
I think it begins with what your agenda really is. So when you're a pastor, for example, your job, part of your job is to represent that tradition or that denomination and that particular community. And when you're a politician, the same thing. So in some ways, your instincts might be noble, but you can easily become beholden to those communities. And so, doing the work that I do, I was able to begin by saying, what is my intention here? And my intention was simply to perpetuate a movement that was born out of empathy and not fear. And so when you do that, then you're not trying to convert someone or fix them or save them. You're simply trying to share life with people through the words, and that's where you meet them. And so there's a different agenda. My motives are simply to inspire and encourage and challenge, and that those words do whatever they're going to do within people. And I don't need to guide them into a particular result. I just want them to ask better questions.
In other words, using your own words and title, how to talk about your religious beliefs and not be a total, you know what?
Yeah, it's a challenge, Alberto. I mean, there are days when I fail it, when you do, because the things that we're talking about, whether it's our politics or our theology, our morality, this is deeply important stuff to all of us. And we know that it's not just about laws and legislation and movements of in politics. This is about human beings ultimately. So we are all deeply passionate about those things. So there should be a measure of energy and confrontation and boldness that happens because of that. But we should try to do that without dehumanizing the person across from us. That is the thing that I reject so often in other people. And so I don't want to do that. So how can I retain my convictions and speak passionately without dehumanizing the person in front of me, without turning them into a caricature or a stereotype? And it's an almost hourly challenge to do that.
I have this tenet that I live by, and that is most people are good people. So, I consider my circle of friends progressives, liberals, conservatives, MAGA, Republicans, all of these folks. I try to stick around, and sometimes I get each segment upset because one may think I'm giving too much agency to another one, etc. But I find that is actually what works best, and you get a chance to develop a level of trust among all these groups. Now, I must say that people like yourself and others that are promoting this type of thing is influential on what I do, the topics that I do, and that's one of the reasons I like having people like you on, because again, I think the more people see many others try to touch on everybody and not necessarily segment people, the more effective we can on changing the country. Now, I'm of the belief that externalities are forcing divisions. Can you elaborate on that if that plays into your platform?
That is a huge challenge for all of us because our politics and our religion have been so tribalized that there's almost an all or nothing mentality that we are thrown into when we simply enter in the fray of discussing something like immigration or healthcare or voting laws. We end up being pulled to those opposite poles, and it's a constant challenge to kind of stay in what I call um, the compassionate middle, the humane middle of people who are really still willing to listen to one another across aisles of difference. And that's one of the challenges for someone like myself who is more progressive, that I'm often set up as an adversary of a certain voting bloc. And I try to make it clear that I'm actually for them as human beings and for their families, that I want the things that I want for the planet: health, affordable health care, great public education. I want those things for them and their families as well as my own. And it's really trying to let them know that the politicians that they support may not have those interests in mind. So that's a huge challenge sometimes, to speak across those divisions and let people know that you're actually fighting for them, not really with them.
Now, you were among all the pastors in the evangelical movement. How did Jesus how did Jesus stop supporting the things that Jesus preached in the Bible? When I say Jesus, I mean the interpretation of Jesus by evangelicals, because you just mentioned so much. You just mentioned the policies. You went from just talking let's say a religious item to on specific policies that help people, things that Jesus all stood for: the foreigner, the immigrant, well-being, humanity. How did that change come about? Why did that change come about?
I think what we find is that most people have the instinct to be decent and to help and to encourage, and they'll begin on an endeavor, and that may be a political endeavor or in a church community. And I think as people gain power or influence, it can be difficult to hold on to the perspective of what actually matters. And I think you see that in the church. You've seen it for thousands of years, but there can be a disconnection, a mission drift from where Jesus began this ministry that was really founded on empathy. And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, it looks almost antithetical to much of the politics and religion we see in America today. And I think that's because as much as we want it to, I don't think the American dream and the gospel of Jesus align very well. And so we have these combating sort of sets of virtues, and often money and power are going to win because we measure things that way more and more in our culture. Whereas I think the movement of Jesus is a movement of the street. It's an organic from the ground up, and it's about interdependent community and looking out for the other. And I don't think that's as fashionable as it used to be. And that's what I say when cruelty is trending. I think we need to bring back compassion as a value of our culture.
You made a very dangerous statement, dear my brother. You made a very dangerous statement. Wait, but I mean a very true statement that is so dangerous to some of the people who run our system and would have us believe otherwise. But I think it is so important that message gets out there, especially coming from a former pastor at one of these mega churches, because it almost gives, look, I know a lot of evangelical Christians, my sister inclusive, and it's amazing that how lock and step they stay with pastors. That's what a pastor is. That is what a pastor is. You pastor people, and they have a lot of power. You had a lot of power within your church. Well, it's interesting because you probably have a lot more power now with the audience that you command. But you had a lot of power with the audience, and it's difficult to deal with how these guys are leading their flock. I want to get a little bit deeper now, away from, let's say, religion, and start to talk a little bit about, after all, this is politics done right.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about politics. What kind of politics would you like to see occur after the election in 2024?
Well, I think a politics that is just like a theology, a politics that is worth something actually gives more access to more people. So I want to see more people represented by our politics. I want to see people welcomed as they are without caveat or condition. And I want a politics that sees that there are people who always have less than we do, and to make sure that we are somehow responsible to and for them, that we realize that our nation, that we are all tethered together. And I don't see that in politics a lot. There's always an angle to a particular policy or a piece of legislation that's being proposed. So I wish we could get to the place where all parties are looking for the common good. And that is the politics that I wish we could see, simply for the common good, and that we could have conversations on necessarily that we may have the same goals, but very different ways that we want to get there. And so some of that's about communicating more effectively and being more willing to come to the table of conversation with a posture of curiosity for the other.
You recently wrote some blogs that I read your blogs, and you recently wrote a blog about some progressives sometimes with the stance that they take can create circumstances that we don't want. And I think that was that was talking about how some of them have been dealing with the current president, Biden. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, as we talked about earlier, when we are deeply empathetic people, we are going to be passionate wherever we see injustice. And the challenge is looking at, we have this influx of urgency and of trauma. And I think we're not really built for how much we're seeing now because of social media. And because of that, it can be difficult to know, how do I get my bearings? Where is my energy best directed? And so I think many times we can be very myopic about something and not see the bigger picture. And for me, the bigger picture is always, where are we historically, and where is our vote? Does it need to be used strategically so that we can make sure that we have a nation going forward where we all do have human and civil rights, where where we do have voting rights? And I want to preserve those things. And so I think we're precariously at the edge of losing some things for a long time. And so that's what I'm constantly battling with. We have the urgency of the moment, but then we have to step back and see what is actually happening here and how can I best work to bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice.
What are your thoughts on the former president?
I believe that he has proven himself to be a man who is not of the character or moral fiber to be leading, because I think there's a deeply seated narcissism that is at play. There's a self-preservation and protection. And so I think we see his ability to do whatever it takes to protect himself at the detriment of our nation and its laws and its institutions. And so for me, I started doing this work, writing explicitly about politics in 2016, because I felt this was a pivot point moment for us, that if we elevated this particular human being, it wasn't about Republican, Democrat, but this particular human being was not equipped and would really pollute so much of our culture. And I feel like that is simply what's happened.
Okay. Well, I mean, in other words, you think, or do you think we are in a moment like many are talking about, that it's sort of that existential moment? We must not have that person as president again?
I think the saddest thing that I've seen is that when we conflate a person with the answer, whatever that question that we have, when we look at a person and say they can, or a political party, they can fix it, that's a dangerous place to be. And I think at this point in time, we can look at the last 8 or 9 years, and you and I know racism wasn't created in 2016, and bigotry and nationalism and misogyny and all these things have existed. But I think there's been a releasing of it, maybe an emboldening of that, because from the leadership has said, we're not going to have those standards in place anymore. And once you have that precedent established, I think you see the floodgates open. And while we've seen so much open hatred and hate crimes and anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim rhetoric and on and on and on. So I do think existentially it's about us as a nation saying, regardless of party, what is the human thing to do here? How do I vote in such a way that I steward the things that I claim to be important to me? Not what I think I believe, but what do I actually believe? And how can I embody this through my vote in some way?
I'm glad. I'm glad for that answer, folks. You need to go ahead and get that book when it drops. I think it drops on what day does it drop? The book
is April 2nd, Tuesday.
April 2nd, folks. The name of the book is "Worth Fighting For: Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending." And I'm looking at an early copy here, folks. And in these times of, I don't want to call it despair, but for many it is despair. Or where you think it's the end, or where you think we are forever against each other, it is great to see writing like this from somebody like John Pavlovitz. So, John, the last question I always ask at the end of my interviews is, what would you have liked me to ask you that I somehow didn't?
Wow. I think I always I would like to be asked about where we go from here, what hope does look like, because as you said, despair is a natural response. And so maybe that's the question.
Let's do it.
I would say that moving forward, we know the reasons that we have to grieve, and it's okay to grieve those things, but hopelessness is never helpful. Hopelessness has never allowed human and civil rights to grow. And so at this place in time in the history of the planet, we're simply here to steward humanity. And so we can be discouraged, we can be frustrated, but we can't be hopeless, because then we stop. And the only way that we fix this is to keep moving. So that's what I hope people will do.
Tell us a little bit about these other projects that you're working about. Tell us about your blog, how to get to your blog. Tell us about, I think it's a new social forum that you've created as well.
Sure. You can find me at johnpavlovitz.com, or my Substack platform, johnpavlovitz.substack.com. The site you're referring to is called Empathetic People Network. And Empathetic People Network is simply a social media community designed to bring people together, like we've been talking about, who may have found the writing as a hub, who the words of compassion resonate with. And we just get together on social media and we share life, and we talk about politics and religion and family and grief. So it's a way to have sort of a controlled social media environment where there's not bots and trolls and ads, and we can simply share life without worrying about someone coming with a combative spirit. It's really about that posture of curiosity that we talked about. So I invite people to check that out as well.
And folks, all the links will be inside of the blog that goes along with this post as well as in other places. A writer, a pastor, an activist, a storyteller, John Pavlovitz. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
My pleasure, my friend. Good to see you.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel. And number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.
Today, I am extremely happy because we're going to touch a section of this country that is very misunderstood. We're going to touch a section of this country that many a times vote against their own interest, their own well-being. Look, Brian Reisinger grew up on a family farm in Sauk County, Wisconsin, and lives to tell the hidden stories of rural America. He is an award-winning writer, speaker, and consultant. Brian worked with his dad on the farm from the time he could walk. His book, Land Rich, Cash Poor, tells the story of the disappearing American farmer, weaving forgotten history with his own family, a four-generation fight for survival. Good. Welcome to Politics Done Right. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So before we get started, tell me a little bit about your history on the farm, where you grew up, etc. Because I want folks to understand that this isn't what we're going to talk about isn't something coming from the left coast or the right coast, but this is reality and something that we don't get a lot of in our mainstream media, how people really live, the tribulations that they're really going through.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you asking. I appreciate your focus on the issue. The reality is that I come from about as much a flyover country as you possibly could. You said it. I grew up working with my dad from the time I could walk, and it goes much deeper than that. We go back 4 generations. My great grandfather actually fled and escaped pre-World War I Europe to come to Wisconsin, to come to the rolling hillsides of farmland in Wisconsin, try to make a better life. And my grandpa grew up in the Great Depression. And that was a time when farms, although things were incredibly hard, farms were such a dynamic part of our industry that he was able to climb into the middle class despite growing up in the Great Depression. My mom and dad survived the farm crisis. And then I grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s as farming went from being able to cut a middle class path through the depths of the Great Depression to barely making ends meet in modern America. I'm lucky. I grew up with a good, solid working middle class background, but it was slipping away for families and farms like ours all over the heartland. And so that's where I'm from. And that is kind of what informs my view on all this stuff as I dove into these issues for the book and as I think about these things now.
Now, tell me, as you see it, what ails the farmer?
Yeah, the thing that ails a farmer right now is an extreme kind of on steroids version of what so many people are experiencing in this economy. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so important. Farmers for generation after generation have been facing higher costs that have been going up, even as the prices they get for their goods may be going down or are volatile. There's structural reasons that that's happening in our economy that really don't have anything to do with one side of the aisle or the other. In particular, these are deep-seated things that have been going on generation after generation. So now when we come into this, time period, and we have people in this economy who are trying to figure out where their place is in this economy, we can learn a lot from the disappearing American farmer, the forces that are driving that disappearance, the things that are making it harder for farms to make ends meet. They're similar to the kinds of things that make it hard for a lot of people to make ends meet. But it's so deeply seated, so wound into what's going on in our country. I think it's really informative. The other thing about it is it does impact every single American dinner table. We're talking about the food supply for every American, and so the hollowing out of rural America is something that everybody in every part of America should care about because it's impacting food prices. It's impacting the security of our supply chain during crises like COVID. It impacts all kinds of things that really have a huge impact on every American family. And the thing is, it's happening back here in Midwestern flyover country where a lot of people don't necessarily realize what's going on.
It's interesting because in with everything that you say, I I study quite a bit of economics, and economics affect the farmer just as much as it affects the average worker, etc. And I look at the aggregators, let's say the ADMs and all the other food aggregators out there. And if I go ahead and I look at the stock market, I'll see that these guys have ever increasing profits. They're paying ever increasing dividends. They're doing very, very well. Now, in a closed system where you have the farmer who sells to a cooperative, who then sells to the ADMs, etc. If everybody in that chain, they're working under our economic system to increase profits, to increase all these other things, somebody gets squeezed. Somebody's profit is money not earned by others. And the way I see it, and you explain to me if I'm wrong here, you are the genesis of the food supply. And if you are the genesis of the food supply, it behooves me an economic system that says the one who produces isn't the one who profits most from that product or that service. Explain.
Yeah, the reality is there's a very big disconnect between what farmers get for their goods, their products, and their crops, and what consumers pay, whether it's in the grocery store or at the restaurant. And we could have an economy where we have a much more, I'll call it economically diverse range of options, different places that farmers sell to, different places that people buy their food from, that's much more diverse than it is right now. We really don't. What we have is a very large global kind of commodity-based supply chain that gets the food from the farm gate to the dinner table, but does it through some very specific and limited channels. Now, some of that has happened through natural competition and things like that in the direction of the industry, but some of that has also happened just because things in the American economy, not just in agriculture, not just in food, but all across the entire American economy have become dominated by big, right? Mm-hmm. And so farmers, the small and medium-sized farmers, but even some of the larger farmers, they're the little guy in that economic picture. And so the squeezing occurs on the farmer. And the problem with that, beyond if you care about farmers, which I think a lot of your listeners probably do, we should care about people who are going through hardship. But irregardless of that, when farms get squeezed and we go from having over 6 million farms a century ago to having lost 4 million of those farms today, that impacts things. The farms that we have are carrying an increasingly perilous burden, and the channels that our food goes through to get to the consumers is one that can at times be incredibly vulnerable during disaster. It's one that is slowing down innovation and can lead to higher prices. It's one that creates all kinds of problems for the consumer, as well as, to your exact point, squeezing the American farmer and creating this disappearance, or at least contributing to it, because there's a lot of factors, but it is a big one. You're right.
We've lied to ourselves quite often. We've said we believe in competition. We've said we believe in having as many people in one domain as possible, yet at the same time, we create laws. And we have to remember one thing. The economy is not divine. The economy was created by human beings. The laws that govern the economy is not divine. Again, these are created by human beings. And the fact that you spoke about channels, how the channels have been restricted in the way you get from the farm to market, that all those things are processes created by man, created by corporations, etc. The farmer, in my opinion, and you explained to me, you're the one who wrote the book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. The farmer has to find a way to take back control from the corporations. Again, we've seen all the profits in the corporations while the farmer gets squeezed. And at the same time, it seems like the farmers are selecting people who tend to believe in that process that squeezes them. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that what farmers have been facing is all of those things combined with the successive instances of economic upheaval, the Great Depression, the farm crisis of the 1980s, the impacts of globalization, some of which have been good, some of which have been bad, the recessions of the more recent years, all of that. When you combine that with what you're talking about, when you combine that with the societal forces of our economy shifting from rural to urban, when you combine that with the way that technology has changed and has begun to leave those small and medium-sized and even some of the larger farmers behind in certain ways, which is something we can get into. You combine all of that, these compounding forces leave farmers in a nearly impossible situation. And the reality is that there is plenty of blame to go around, and that's the bad news. The good news is that means there's plenty of things that people on both sides of the aisle can do about it. One of the things that I think that folks on the right have failed to do is recognize what's happening in competition in this country, to your point, and that it's something that they believe in. I think many of them maybe in good faith, but it's something that has slipped away and policy-wise has not necessarily carried through in a way that can protect not only farmers, but small businesses, consumers of all kinds. There's things that I think the other side of the aisle has also done where the role of government has maybe been captured by folks who use it for things different than what it was intended for when we think about subsidies and things like that. And so that's why I think it's important to have honest conversations about both sides. But I think you're absolutely right. And I will say, I think that, people in the heartland, people in rural areas, they have a lot of reasons for voting the way they vote. One of the things that we do need to do is we need to see an entirely new reorientation by both political parties, and not just the parties, but all ends of the political spectrum around how are we going to create more opportunities for our farmers? Not just how are we going to support our farmers, because you do hear people on both sides of the aisle say, oh, I support the farmers, and they'll give lip service. They might even throw an initiative at a farmer now and then. There's certainly plenty of support in a general sense for farmers. They're a beloved people. They're wrapped up in our national identity. So I'm not going to say that nobody cares about the farmers, but I will say that I don't think our policy has been geared toward actually making a difference. And the question is not, what do you think of the farmers? Because everyone will say, oh, we love farmers. We love the Super Bowl commercials. We love those stories telling us about farmers overcoming adversity in the Great Depression. We love that stuff. It makes us feel good as Americans. But we've been stamping farmers out systematically. And so if we ask ourselves the question, what are we doing to create new opportunities for farmers, new market opportunities, new places that farmers can sell more goods, and in turn, consumers and hardworking American families more places and ways they can get their food? That's what's going to help solve this. That's what's going to change a lot of these deep-seated policy problems.
I agree wholeheartedly. Now, let's talk a little bit about policy. You're a dairy farmer. You and your dad were dairy farmers. And just a question here. Your business was fairly profitable, but it's more difficult each year. It gets more difficult with all the different rules, et cetera. You spoke earlier about technology and how technology affects the small farmer. Specifically, how does technology affect the small farmer?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great question. A note on how my background informs it. You're absolutely right. My dad was a dairy farmer. He's third generation. I worked with him, and then I also entered the journalism and the public policy world. So I end up, for better or for worse, getting a unique view of this, having lived it and then having worked in that realm. My sister still works with my dad, and we now have a farm that doesn't milk cows anymore, but raises cows for other farms, raises beef for consumers, and raises a wide variety of cash crops. The reason we did that is exactly what you just said, which is that it was becoming harder and harder each year for a dairy farmer of our size to be able to make it. So we have made a change. We're in that transition. Where does technology fit into that? This is one of the great untold chapters of what's happened to the disappearing American farmer. People remember the farm crisis in the 1980s, and that it was its own little depression just for rural communities. And what was going on around that same time was there had been a shift in technology in this country. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were people leaving rural areas for urban areas, and there was a need to figure out a way to make it so that farms could continue to operate with less labor because they had people leaving because there were better paying jobs in the city. So one of the ways you could do that is you could have technology help farms get better scale, meaning take on more acres, take on more animals with fewer people breaking their backs to do it. Some of that was good because we were losing workforce to the urban areas and because farming's hard work. And man, modernizing it and help it be more efficient is a good thing in general. I think we can all agree on some amount of that. But what happened is it went so far. And by the time we got to the 70s and 80s, those farm wages and those factory wages kind of caught up. We didn't need to have technology making it possible for farms to get bigger and bigger anymore. That had worked out and it was just fine. The technology was now leaving behind those medium and small size farms. What we needed was what's called scale neutral technology. That means that it's affordable enough and practical enough for farmers of all sizes. So instead of the big implements being pulled behind tractors that cover huge amounts of fields, bigger than a lot of farms have, and more expensive than a lot of farms can afford, we needed technology that was going to work for farms at all levels of that kind of chain. And we didn't have that. And by the time we got to the 70s and 80s, by the time we moved into the farm crisis, technology was leaving farms behind as well. So we got on the other side of that farm crisis. All that economic devastation came into the 90s, and the small and medium-sized farms that remained, not only had they weathered that terrible storm of the farm crisis, they also didn't have the technology they needed to be able to continue to compete in this economy.
Now, so the reality is we could have had policy that mitigated that. We could have had policies that gave certain advantages for small farms. Let me say something. We always talk about security. We always talk about the national security. And we tend to look at that from a militaristic point of view, not realizing that having a diverse bunch of folks who farm. Let me give an example. Suppose we created one large farm. It would always be more efficient to have one huge farm, one manager, and everything works fine. But you shoot that manager, or that manager gets sick, or something happens, you no longer have diversity. With the lack of diversity, you kill the crop. That's why we like to have diversity in crops, diversity in all these things to ensure the sustainability over time. Now, as it turns out, there is a downside. There's an upside to having huge farms. I mean, there's an upside to having huge farms. Theoretically, prices could fall because there's less labor, efficiency of scales, etc. The price you pay are two, right? One in which we can hurt ourselves if there is a major problem. We found that with the milk industry, right, with the Similac, when the baby food industry, by concentrating that into one area, when one plant went down, it was a national issue. Same thing with farming. We could have that problem. Now the issue is here that we lose our security by not having a whole bunch of small and medium-sized farms throughout our nation. And only policy can control that, because efficiency is not the only thing we should be searching for. We should be searching for sustainability as well. And one of the problems with this efficiency is that efficiency didn't go to pay farmers for having brought us to that point. It went into the pockets of the few who controlled capital.
And here's what's happening. We have had basically the holy grail of food and agriculture policy in this country has been about cheap food.
Mm-hmm.
And cheap food is, to your point, is a worthy goal. The reality is that food becoming a smaller share of household budgets is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of things about our system that have been a modern miracle in that regard. But when cheap food is the only thing you're going after, you lose having an economy that has a way that can be lasting and can be durable, to your point, being sustainable. And so we needed to have something a little bit different. We need to gear our government policy around what's going to create opportunities for those farmers, because if you create opportunity for those farmers to continue to thrive in a wide variety of businesses of all sizes, both the farms and in the general agriculture and food sectors, to be able to thrive, you have more choices for people. You have more durability. You have all the things that you're talking about that we're lacking. And it's because our holy grail was only cheap food, which again is a good goal, but it's part of, it should just be part of it. It shouldn't be the only holy grail. So what we ended up having happen is, yes, the economy shifted more and more toward only efficiency, and efficiency is good and we need it. But shifting only toward efficiency means that we lost other things along the way. And that's a real problem. And it's a systemic issue. You talked about the Similac issue during COVID. We saw this. We had farmers desperately trying to find places to sell their food products and their prices going down. And we had consumers desperately looking for goods and their prices going up. How does that happen? Why can't the farmer and the consumer just walk across the street and help each other out? Because we have this large system that some of it is needed. We have to have a sophisticated supply chain to compete globally, to be able to supply different types of markets, but it doesn't have to come at the expense of also having local and regional economies that are robust. They give people options where you can go down the street to your grocery store, you can go to a specialty food store, you can stop off at a farmer's market, you can go to the local meat shop, you can do all the different things that you would do. You don't have to go 20 places to get your groceries. I'm not saying that, but you can have the ability to go a couple different places and to be able to have different access points for things. That's good for families. That's good for American competition and businesses of all kinds and all sizes. And that's good for the farms. But unfortunately, we have instead have this situation that has squeezed farms nearly out of existence and has created problems for everybody as a result.
We are wedded to one economic system, and we are wedded to one group of folks who decide what the economic system is going to look like. And I've always said this, even during every recession we've had, even through the Depression, even through what we think is a growing economy, is that if you have a lot of people ready to do the work, you have a lot of products out there, and somehow you get unemployment and a shortage of product. The problem is not the people. The problem is not the lack of resources. The problem is a failed economic system. And I think until we're honest about that, we do, in fact, if farmers are suffering, if farmers are dwindling, if all these things are occurring, you cannot say you have a healthy economic system or economic system that works for people if people are suffering within that system. Let's say your dad, when you were growing up on the farm, let's say your dad got some sort of a very chronic illness that really stopped him from being able to run that farm. And to save his life, he had to have this $1 million surgery or whatever. Your entire farm would be on the, would be at risk. Yet, there are societies, and I always like to talk about our brothers and sisters in Norway or other places where all those things are mitigated. I had a guy who listens to my show in Norway, and he called and he said he's an American who moved to Norway because of those particular incidences. His son got paralyzed and over in Norway, and he was just amazed that a bad act or a illness or being hurt by your cotton gin or what, or a cow kicking you and making you sick or whatever, didn't mean the end of the family farm or the end of your financial security. So I think I think having people like yourself out there writing books like this, telling people as it is. And look, I am a very political person, but if you notice, as I asked the question, I tried to make it non-political in the way, because it's a thing that affects people. It affects people's lives. And what we're looking for is the solutions that one must find to make sure all are sustainable. Now, let me just say, Brian, I ask questions, etc., but you wrote the book. What would you have liked to say or tell us that my questioning was lacking in?
We've had great questions, and it's been a really great discussion. I love being able to engage with people from all different viewpoints and all different places, because that's what we're going to need to be able to do to solve this issue. And so I appreciate the dialogue. One of the things that was really interesting and rewarding for me was being able to take a lot of these big macroeconomic forces and societal forces and technological forces that I researched to figure out what had been going on and connect that with my family's experience. That was very personally rewarding for me. I also think it's, I hope, one of the things that will make the book compelling to people, that will make people want to pick up Land Rich Cash Poor and be glad they did, which is to say they will learn about these issues we've been talking about, but they'll also see what it's like for our family. And so, I'd like to talk for a moment just about what that's been like. I mentioned my great grandfather coming over here, escaping pre-World War I Europe. He worked under debt for decades to be able to establish our farm. And my grandfather grew up through the Great Depression to be able to get into the middle class. Even in the modern day, I was amazed at how these big forces combined with things that happen in our life. My grandpa, when he was a man and my dad was 8 years old, my grandpa fell off a corn crib and broke his back. And my dad stepped up at the tender age of 8. And he's been milking cows and farming ever since that time to help out. When my dad was a parent and was going through kind of middle age, and I was 14 years old, my dad ended up having the need to have a really important surgery because of some internal bleeding things he was having. At 14, I stepped up. My dad was laid up for a month and a half. And you're right. These things, they put the farm at stake, and it really presses down on families like ours. And we're so grateful for the opportunity to do this and to live close to the land and to help feed the country. But also just the things that happen to a family when you're living close to the land and you're subject to the weather, the wind, the rain, the economic forces, the physical danger and the peril that can happen. It's really a rewarding thing to be able to tell those stories about what happened when people were in danger, when people overcame adversity, when people worked in ways they never thought that they could. And when we face all that wind and rain, and to be able to connect that with what's going on in the broader economy and to try to reveal something to people from urban and rural America, like, that's been a really rewarding thing to be able to do.
Let me tell you, Brian, teachers and farmers are the two biggest heroes, in my opinion, when we think about it. They feed us and they move us forward. They move knowledge forward. The two most important jobs in this country, in the world. Yet I believe too often they're some of the least respected. They're always given accolades. It's great to give a farmer and a teacher accolades. But when it is time to invest in doing what's necessary to make sure each of these are healthy, we find teachers scraping and we find farmers doing the same. I hope with the advent of your book, with some of what you've spoken here and going before, that people would start looking into real policies that make lives better for the farmer, the teacher, and all these people that are the heroes in our society. So with that, Brian Reisinger, author of Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope and the Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer, who we don't want disappeared, folks. Let's make sure to go out and get this book. Let's make sure and support our farming community. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Well, thank you for having me. It's available on Amazon and other places online now. It's going to be in bookstores August 20th. I hope that people do pick it up and help join the fight to help save our farms. I appreciate you raising the awareness of these issues, and have a great show.
And folks, you're going to see all the direct links to the book right in the associated blog post for this particular program, and this will be aired on air as well. Thank you so kindly, Brian.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans